Well, morning everybody. Morning. And thanks very much indeed for inviting me today, John. It's a pleasure to come along and to take part in this. This panel is about the Progressive Advertiser, as has been said. And so I thought we would start with a bit of audience participation, so you can all join in at this point. It's not too complicated. Could you raise your hands if you're an advertiser? Progressive or otherwise, I should say. Okay, so there aren't any advertisers here, so so that makes my first point, which is we do spend an awful lot of time talking to ourselves, don't we, really? But but I'm sure we'll come back to that point at the end anyway. So we can say what we like, basically, chaps. It's, you can say what you want. It's completely open house. No one's going to give you a hard time. So this term, Progressive Advertiser, is in the program that you have received, but just to summarize it, it says, and I quote, I wouldn't like you to think this is me saying this is a quote, "There's now no place to hide, nowhere for media agencies, planners or buyers to work their dark alchemy," that bit is not me, by the way, in isolation from the security or opinion of their clients. So the question is, of course, that are there such things as progressive advertisers? What is a progressive advertiser? So why don't we start at the far end, Christine? Would you like to give me your definition, and have you actually come across any of these strange creatures?
Well, I think in this context that we are discussing today, a progressive advertiser, we think of someone that is really using data and technology to improve their business results. I think if we think within that definition, clients that they are very DR focused and they use digital as an acquisition channels, they are progressive by default because they have to be, because it goes directly at the bottom line. So for us, for instance, EasyJet is a client that always pushes to that direction. So I think what it makes them a really progressive advertiser, in my opinion, is that they bring the data from the business, real sales data, and it's the first data that they try to leverage when they buy media. So I think now, of course, they are bringing more things together and trying to develop, again, the infrastructure that is required to the point that someone made before. It's about how we measure everything in one context, in the context of business. So I think EasyJet could be one of those.
So Ciaran, do you feel there are many such creatures around?
No.
I didn't think you did.
There's no such thing as a progressive advertiser. There should be a progressive agency. In Europe, anyway, for my part, it's always the strategies led by the agency. So I think the narrative should be around progressive agencies as opposed to progressive clients, because at the end of the day, the client is going to do what the agency says anyway. So.
He clearly doesn't work in an agency.
Well,
yeah. How many agencies?
Around Programmatic, I think that's the case anyway. I mean, obviously, some of the agency people can tell me that, but I disagree. I mean, I've been in these events for 5 years, and only a handful of marketers turn up, so they're progressive marketers. If you ask me what a progressive marketer is, I think it's someone who takes most of it in-house. Recates, Booking.com, those type of guys, marketing. What was it? Money Saver Market, sorry. They're progressive, but the rest of the brands, the rest of the clients are dependent on agencies, and that's the way I see it. So I think the conversation should be around progressive agencies and where they sit.
So do you think progressive advertisers then don't necessarily need agencies, or do you think?
I think they need agencies. Of course, they need agencies. Otherwise, there would be no agency there. But I think that I could count progressive agencies in one hand in Europe, and that's a reality.
You can probably count agencies on one hand these days, can't you? In total.
Well, you can count the trading desk in two hands, I suppose, and then the network's in about 50 or 60 hands, depending on what you sit in the ecosystem, SSP or DSP, whatever. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I disagree entirely. I think that there's a new landscape out there that's allowing advertisers really to be progressive and to move away from what they've spent the last 50 years planning around, which is a demographic segment that they've spent time researching and working out who their customers are, and move towards a point where they're looking at points of influence on the journey through to a purchase or purchase intent, brand uplift, and this new environment's giving them an opportunity to be progressive. Instead of saying we have a specific target audience that we want to buy in a specific silo, maybe it's on digital, maybe it's in the TV space, they're actually going to say what are the points of influence that we can influence, that we can reach out to somebody in our advertising. And this landscape is giving them a new opportunity to do that. So I think there are progressive advertisers out there, and the tools that we're providing now and that are becoming available are giving them access to really change the way they do it.
If I can add to that, I think that's very, I would support that entirely, because in this environment, what progressive advertisers, and I think in the DR focus is easy because they have very clear metrics, but what brand advertisers they are doing is developing their own metrics for this space. And now the technology, we mentioned about viewability, it allows to measure quality in a completely different way and create new ways of what quality is, what value is. And that by default makes them, again, be very progressive about it. It's not that's it done, because to develop that infrastructure to get into this space is not an easy thing for advertisers to get around to it.
Okay, Andy, would you like to? Andy, obviously a progressive agency here, by the way.
I was a progressive marketer for a few years, which is interesting because I've kind of been on both sides. So Money Supermarket, and I think it, and then obviously now at MediaCom, and I think it's interesting because the clients that are progressive are in many ways forced to be progressive. So when we look at a lot of the DR businesses, they're heavily dependent on search, for example, and in many cases they're reaching maturity in paid search. The way that Google is evolving natural search, for example, the dynamics have changed completely. That it means for many of those brands they've got to think about coming publishers. So they need to think about diversifying their media mix, and then it's really thinking, okay, what's the big opportunity now with broadly in programmatic to actually move the needle, not just on acquisition, but actually to think about moving beyond that and address some of the strategic challenges that they have in becoming more customer-centric. So that's, yes, acquisition's critical, but it's also thinking about how do we focus on retention, how do we focus on cross-sell and upgrade, and some of those other kind of bigger strategic challenges. I do think it's interesting because, to Ciaran's point, one of the big challenges with advertisers is education. And it doesn't matter what we do, whether we're a technology platform, whether we're an agency. I believe, the big challenge for all of us is to help educate advertisers. On this new landscape, which is moving very quickly. And to give you an example, I sat yesterday with a client team from a big auto manufacturer, and started at a pretty low level in terms of talking about the way that we used to buy, display media, and the way that we can buy display media now, and what that means, not just for the automotive sector, but for that individual client. And you start to see the reaction, and it's just, it's a massive opportunity for advertisers, but I still think a lot of advertisers don't really understand the ecosystem, and it's up to us, to help push that forward.
Paul,
Absolutely.
you work with many big advertisers.
Yeah, typically our business right now is agency-led, but previously in agency roles, we certainly worked with numerous number of blue chip brands. I think I'm glad we moved on from the first question, which was what is a progressive advertiser. I think progressive is a fairly subjective term, and it's like asking what is premium and what is premium programmatic, and you could be here all day talking about that. I think going back to what Andy said is, I think it's the advertisers that have the curiosity and the ones that are engaging and being more interactive of what we all talk about. They're the ones that are becoming more progressive because they're becoming more hands-on, they're becoming more involved in the technical partnerships that they're deals with. And they're asking more questions of agencies, like an Annalect group, for instance, about how are you building me IP on top of this infrastructure? And I think they're the ones that are the more progressive. It doesn't necessarily mean just brands, that what you said, Ciaran, that do it in-house. I think it's the ones that are just becoming more challenging of their agency partners and vendors like ourselves and the rocket fuels to say, what are you going to do on top of this? How are you going to create competitive advantage for myself? I think they're the ones that are becoming more progressive.
I think maybe we should move away a little bit from this, but one of the points that was made earlier on by Kirk was that there are obviously stresses and strains right now in the ecosystem, as it were, certainly in the States. In fact, there was a poll of chief marketing officers in Advertising Age yesterday that was released in Advertising Age yesterday that said over 50% of CMOs are now looking to buy programmatic ads directly, bypassing their agencies altogether. So I don't know whether that counts as being progressive, whether you see that. Do you see that as being a trend, Ciaran, or do you think that's just stuff that funny American people do?
Well, the Americans are a funny lot, but they're a decent lot as well. But in the US, I think the marketers are much more hands-on from what I see. They're much more they're much more involved in the process.
They're involved, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're hands-on.
Yeah.
I think they ask more questions. They become more aware of what lies beneath. They want to see under the hood. But I don't think that necessarily means they're just going to migrate it in-house.
We're not saying that our European players are not capable as well. I'm just saying that they're much more sort of involved in the process. It's an interesting poll. I don't know. I mean, does that mean that the agencies are being disintermediated because someone has to actually execute these buys? They're not all doing it themselves. So I'll be interested to see who they're actually going to directly to do these buys. Is it the DSPs, or is it kind of like the P&G audience science relationship? I mean, it raises some questions about the value of the agency in the process. Andy did a great presentation at ATS this year about how the agency stays relevant in this new programmatic world, and it was quite interesting because there was deep relationships between the agency and the actual client themselves, this client trading desk model, which I think is quite, that's progressive. That's quite a progressive way of doing things. But it does raise sort of an interesting question about where the agency sits now in this whole sort of changed ecosystem.
Yeah, I think we'll come on to that in just a moment.
Sorry, I didn't mean to create
no, not at all. Dominic, do you want to say something about?
What about the agency trading desk model?
Well, we'll come on to agency trading desk model in a minute. About the advertisers doing.
I think advertisers. There is a trend right now where advertisers are becoming disillusioned with the fact that their media owners, that the media agencies that they've been working with, are pushing them towards a trading platform, which they have a significant and own investment in. And there is a distrust around that, and the events I've attended over the last 3 years there's been more and more noise. It's not just happening in the US. I think it's beginning to happen here, where clients are questioning their agencies both for their independent advice and then the point at which they make the buy and the margins associated with that buy. I think that this new landscape offers up a series of opportunities for best in class. And those best in class, I believe, should be outside of the media agency.
If you work directly with an advertiser, would you encourage them to invest on your platform?
I think, of course.
Is that not
Yes, but the question is...
I would encourage them to go for the greatest ROI. For every pound spent, I would encourage them to look at the return on that. And if that comes through a platform which is owned by the same people that are advising them where to spend, then so be it. But if it's not, I would encourage them to have an open view on where that can come from.
I have to say, I'm going to start defending the agencies on this. I think they're well within their rights.
Can I do that?
Sorry.
Because
Okay, you're from an agency.
There is actually one thing that I
forgot you were an
wanted to do.
agency.
I think, you guys are talking in the way of, okay, we're going to, advertisers that go to these whatever trading desk or these different ways of buying media. But I think what they are doing, and for me it's very interesting to see, is that they are measuring that pot of media in a very small context. So, and if I'm sorry that I'm going down to the detail, when we set up one campaign for an advertiser, everything is measured in just one technology. So everything is deduced. We create a single view of that. If we ask some of these retargeting companies, some of these trading desks, okay, you have to run in this model, they will say, oh no, of course, because if they run in that model, then the duplication eliminates 50% of what they are claiming as sales. So I think the role of the agency, it doesn't necessarily change, because our objective is to bring everything in and also provide that single view that the clients, they need to have control over media, whether it's programmatic or not. And that's the ambition that we have. And I see there is a lot of people that they have very smart, technology, and I think, in a very small context or, with very specific objectives, they definitely deliver. But in the wider context, I mean, they themselves, they say, oh, if you put 25,000 pixels in your site, I can deliver whatever ROI. Well, we can do that as well. That's very easy. That's not the problem.
But if you talk about the wider context, surely, advertisers generally, I hate to break this to all of you, but actually they do quite a lot of other stuff apart from digital.
No,
now, the question is, are agencies doing much to integrate the offline and the online pieces within their organizations? Why is Annalect a separate thing from O&D, for example?
Well, it is not a separate thing from O&D. It's within the Omnicom Media Group, and actually we power O&D services, so it's totally not completely different. It's where we have the group of specialists that focus on creating that solution, but it is part of the group as OMD is, and we work. Our first client, if you want, is OMD, so whatever is delivered in that way.
So you're going to start to, give Andy a chance to say something about this too, you're going to start presumably, therefore, to bring together, television audience data.
Yeah, but if someone has done it, I will clap it. I think the reality is that technology is there, and we can measure in terms of what is the impact of, if you have run this, what is the performance that you have delivered. Matching this audience to this audience, well, we keep testing it, we keep thinking, and what about if we do it in this way? today we haven't cracked it. I mean, you can crack it you spoke about MasterCard, Visa, the data is very rich. We can play around with that, but we cannot do it for 1,000 clients. But I believe we will get there, and then definitely the ambition is there.
Andy, is this the way that...
I certainly wasn't arguing that agencies don't have the value in that.
Yeah.
What I'm suggesting is that there are, and the first-party data is an incredibly important piece of it.
Yeah.
What I'm worried about is the shift right now towards a trading desk, which is on the face of it an indendependent, but actually sits as an underscore of the revenue generated by that revenue.
Okay, well, let's come on. Let's just hang on. Let's give Andy a chance to...
Okay. So it's interesting because I think, for me, sitting agency side now, it's absolutely about doing what's right for my client. Yes, we have Xaxis, which obviously is our group trading desk. I believe that from a client perspective, I will have relationships, with other technology platforms and vendors in the marketplace. Because for a client, we're expected by the client to innovate. We're expected to continually test and evaluate. And the reality of a client putting all of their spend into one platform is naive. That's not going to happen. One thing I would say, and as Ciaran said, the presentation at ATS earlier this year was very much about this. The media agency has got to think about how it re-engineers and reinvents itself. And there's specific areas, right? So we talked about the importance of data and progressive advertisers. That's one of the key challenges for them. How do we get all of this disparate data, right, into one place? How do we leverage insight from it? How do we build predictive models? How do we drive decisioning in real time, not just in programmatic, but potentially in other channels as well, as they become programmatically enabled? So I think it's a couple of things. I think it's about always doing what's right for the client. And then yes, of course, at the end of the day, if Xaxis, as our group trading desk, delivers great results, brilliant. But equally, we have to be open to working with other technology.
And do you think there's to your point, Dominic, you've been making about trading desks, do you think there's a trust issue underneath this? Is this what it really basically boils down to? Trust between client and agency. Do you think that's what's really causing the problem here?
Issue right now. What Andy just described is very relevant to your group, and I think there is an openness to trade with what's best in market, but that isn't the case across many of the agency groups right now. And so my point was pointing to that, which isn't discussed much, but is an underline of the way that this business is growing, which is forced technologies based on relationships that the agency has.
Going to your earlier point around brands bringing stuff in-house, I think particularly with the CMOs that probably participate in that poll, but the ones that have been courted heavily at the Festival of Medias and so forth, that have been made to think that it's as simple as sticking someone in front of a UI, pressing a button and away you go. I think that's been mis-selling by tech companies in the space. I think the value of an agency, a trading desk, that's not up for discussion. I think there is a value there. I think just the way that they engage the trading desks and independents or wherever it might be, how they engage with advertisers, that model will change, which will reshape future offerings. But I think what we will have to start becoming is more nimble and agile. And what you mentioned is the infrastructure you've created is if an advertiser says, I want you to do this all around this stack. I want you to do it all on around Google stack. How can you impart what you do on top of that? Now, or yourself or ourselves or anyone that's been engaged to be, how do you work in that environment? Because at the moment it's kind of like, this is it, you come and take it. But I think over the future, in 12 months, advertisers will start becoming more involved in developing their own stack. And then you've just got to be able to be nimble enough to be operating inside that infrastructure.
And they should. I think, I wish the clients, they dedicate the time to develop that, because then it's much easier to prove the value that everybody adds.
Yep.
And,
I think
Paul's point, Brian, is a good one. As an industry, a lot of these CMOs, as Paul said, have been heavily courted by tech companies for obvious reasons. But what they tend to think is that the technology is everything, and the technology is absolutely critical, but it's an enabler. It's everything else that you build around that. So, how do you connect to inventory? How are you going to connect your data sources? How are you going to customize in terms of predictive models? Yeah. All of that is where essentially the agency, I believe, can create value in the future. But there are still a number of CMOs, within major advertisers that think it's just the tech platform. And it's
I agree with that. That's why a company like us in the technology space have not courted clients. We've courted agencies because we believe there is a huge value in that. And we as a tech company don't have any aspiration to be an agency, but there are agencies that have aspirations to be tech companies.
No, but the biggest problem you've got, and Paul for that matter, is that you now compete with ad networks. Trading desks are just ad networks, right? Agencies set up ad networks to make more money, make more margin. That's the reality of the situation. Xaxis is now the third biggest ad network in the world. And that's a fact, that's a reality. And that's why these two companies here, like MediaIQ and Rocketfuel, have got to figure out how to work with these new ad networks. Are sitting on a plan taking lots of money. We can talk about trading desks, but I think that's a misnomer. That's it. There's no such thing as a trading desk. It's an ad network. It sits on the media plan, it executes on behalf of the agency, and it takes a margin. That's an ad network.
I would argue that the process of ad networks is, the ad network as a whole is the industry right now. The access to inventory is no longer the problem. And we're talking about that in historic terms. You can access 1.7 billion impressions every day in the UK right now. There's enough to actually make decisions. The ad network is an old word. It should go away. It's about making choices.
But I mean, the issue, just come back to this issue. I mean, it seems to me that there's a fundamental issue of trust here. I mean, if you go back, if you're like really, really old, like what I am, you will remember days when Procter & Gamble used to buy all their own television. You remember days when Heineken and one or two other big Dutch advertisers got together to form a media agency. You'll remember days when Mercedes-Benz did the same thing in Germany, formed their own media agency because they didn't trust the agency offerings out there at that time. Now, all of those things have changed. And the reason they've changed is because they work out quite quickly that actually the agency model can add value. And that's why P&G stopped doing what they used to do. Debis failed, and why the Mercedes thing failed too. So there's lots of reasons why people go to agencies, but fundamental to it is the agency needs absolutely to be in a position to add value and to make that value very, very clear. And if they don't, then people will go off and do the other thing, whether they're being courted by Charlie Crow or anybody else, doesn't really much matter. But they're being, they will go where they think they can get the best possible deal. And if they think they're being fleeced, they're not going to go to the agencies. The agencies need to reposition themselves to add real value along that chain, and then they will find themselves flourishing. And frankly, the issue of money will kind of go away. It seems to me.
The agency model is healthy. It's still growing. I mean, there's not like name a big blue chip that's just said two fingers up to any agency and doing it all themselves. It's just not going to happen.
I cannot speak for what other trading desks they are doing, but when it comes to, and I think I'm fair believer in programmatic and how it can add really good value to that. But I think Ciaran is being very, very negative. That makes me surprised since he runs a blog all about this, or aside. But
I don't think I'm being negative. I'm just being
no, I think you are being very negative. For this one. I think when we think about the trading desk, and when we think about, of course, trading desks leverage technology, as agencies, of course, we want to leverage everything that we have, which is the access to the media owners. But we are already starting to say what is the value. And again, I can only talk for what we do. For us, trading desk is integrated in what we buy. So it's measured within what we buy. So it's not the network associated there in the corner. It's completely different. It's already there in the business, delivering with the new tools that we have to deliver that. I mean, I think sometimes, clients, they also force you to do things for what Brian said about what is value for clients. Well, value for clients often is very cheap prices. So, sorry, I don't know about you guys, but if you want to buy something, a very nice suit, probably that's not going to come cheap. And if you want cheap and then you want a very nice suit, somewhere you have to make the compromise. So I think it's about where those advertisers, where they're thinking that quality is, and people.
Okay, let's move on a bit. By the way, I mean, why anybody would think of calling these operations trading desks after these nice, morally respectable people who sit over there in the city, I really can't imagine. But if ever you wanted to do something that would give an industry a bad name before you even start, that would probably have been it. But anyway, let's move on. I mean, a lot of you talk about ROIs on your website. It's probably the most bandied about and probably also the most misunderstood word used in the marketing lexicon. But anyway. Return on investment. It doesn't mean Republic of Ireland, by the way. Just in case.
I thought it was.
Yeah, I know that's what you thought. But return on investment. But when you define it, all of you, I guess, I'm talking particularly to Dominic and to Paul here, are talking specifically, I guess, about short term.
Well, it's a shame that we are, and the reason we are is that the majority of buys that are happening in the programmatic space today are based on that short term. But I think it's so much more than that. The available vehicles of many different mobile video display, the digital landscape gives far greater impact than what happened on the last click or who bought the next impression. It should be about what it did to the brand on the way, and I think we as an industry need to address that. There are advertisers that are beginning to investigate that, and there are tools to allow us to do it better. But it's the beginning of that, and I think that's what I would address this room to, really, since we seem to be talking to ourselves a lot, is how do we get advertisers to understand the value of this comparative to TV, outdoor, traditional media forms.
But there are people, of course, who do that. In fact, in your holding company, there's one called OHAL,
micro data, weather, for example, what impact does that have for an automotive manufacturer? So, how do you think about that data planning? How do you get that data into one place? How do you build the models off it? They can be executed with different platforms, different tech partners. But again, it comes back to how does the agency create value and get paid in a transparent or remunerated in a transparent way for creating that value?
Right. I mean, I think people who say media planning is becoming irrelevant have never actually done anything about media planning, quite honestly. And the fact is that if you're a media planner right now, this is the sort of things you've all been talking about is absolutely spot on. It's really relevant. Most media planners, do they really understand all of this? No, I'm sure they don't. I mean, just in the same way that most of you probably don't understand much about media planning. But they need to understand it much, much more. And to go to Andy's point, what seems like several hours ago, we need to educate people very much more. And when you said that, I had a kind of sudden flashback to standing in a room very like this, actually, far too long ago, and people were saying exactly the same thing about we need to educate clients in the way of media, we need to advertise, we need to educate clients in the way of TV, we need to educate clients in the way of anything, and actually we've done a really crap job actually over the years, it has to be said. So you guys are going to do a better job. Anyway, I'd like to thank all of the people on this panel for a very enjoyable and I hope you find enlightening conversation. So please give them all a round of applause.